Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Talk about a line that stops you in your tracks.
It's classic Kris Kristofferson from me and Bobby McGee. You probably know it even if you don't think you do. But the recent news about his passing, especially reading that New York Times obituary you sent in, reminded us that he was so much more than just that one hit. So we're diving into the life and legacy of this singer-songwriter, actor, and all-around iconoclast. And we're lucky enough to have an expert riding shotgun to guide us. You know how some people just have a knack for connecting the dots and unearthing hidden depths? Well, that's our expert today. Let's jump right in. This obituary paints a picture of a life full of almost cinematic contrasts. I mean, here's a guy who goes from Rhodes Scholar to country music legend. Where do we even begin to unpack that?
It is fascinating, isn't it? You're right, it does read like a movie script. Kristofferson's life was anything but predictable. He was born in Texas, a military family background, and everything pointed towards a very traditional path of success. He even excels at it, becomes a Rhodes Scholar, which, by the way, is about as prestigious as it gets in academia.
The pressure to follow that preordained path must have been immense. But then he makes this almost unthinkable decision to leave it all behind for songwriting.
Exactly. And not just songwriting, but specifically country music songwriting. Imagine the guts it took to trade the halls of Oxford for the honky-tonks of Nashville, especially back then. The obituary mentions his family actually disowning him for a while because they saw it as throwing away his future. But for Kristofferson, it seems there was no other choice. He was answering a different kind of calling.
Okay, so picture this. It's the late 1960s. Nashville is this melting pot of musical talent, and in walks this former Army captain with an Oxford education. You'd think he'd stick out like a sore thumb, right?
You'd think so. And in a way he did. The Nashville establishment didn't quite know what to make of him at first. Interestingly, his early material was considered almost too polished, too literary for the raw, gritty sound that defined country music at the time.
So he had to learn how to speak the language of heartache and hardship, not just read about it in poetry books.
Precisely. He had to find a way to bridge the gap between his intellectual background and the everyday experiences of the people he was trying to reach with his music. And he did. He learned to incorporate those rhythms, those stories of ordinary people into his songwriting, and that's when things started to click.
And boy, did they click. Even if it wasn't always his voice singing them. His songs became massive hits for some of the biggest names in music. Janis Joplin, Johnny Cash, Sammy Smith. Me and Bobby McGee, Sunday Morning Coming Down, Help Me Make It Through the Night. These weren't just chart toppers, they became anthems. What do you think it was about his writing that resonated so deeply with people?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? On one hand, Kristofferson's songs were undeniably rooted in classic country music themes, love, loss, longing, the struggles of everyday life. But he tapped into something more profound, something universal. He had this uncanny ability to capture the complexities of human emotion with a rawness and honesty that transcended genre. And it wasn't just his lyrics, it was his voice, too. It wasn't your typical polished Nashville sound. It had a grit, a lived-in quality that perfectly matched the stories he was telling.
And speaking of authenticity, we can't talk about Kristofferson without mentioning his other title, outlaw country. It's a term used to describe a group of artists in the late 60s and 70s who rebelled against the slick commercial sound of mainstream Nashville. They weren't afraid to push boundaries both musically and thematically, and Kristofferson was right there in the thick of it.
He was a pivotal figure in that movement. Along with artists like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Cash, they brought a new level of rawness and rebellion to country music. They sang about real-life struggles, questioned authority, and weren't afraid to be politically outspoken. They appealed to a generation that was yearning for something authentic, something that spoke to their own experiences.
And that connection was more than just musical. They were friends, collaborators, almost like a brotherhood of outlaws. Didn't they form a supergroup?
They did. It's not every day you see a gathering of legends like that. The Highwaymen, Kristofferson, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Cash. It's hard to top that lineup in terms of sheer songwriting prowess and stage presence. Their concerts were legendary.
Their voices blending on that song, Highwayman, chills every time. But getting back to Kristofferson's journey, the obituary mentions Johnny Cash actually playing a pivotal role in his career.
That's right. The story goes that Kristofferson was still relatively unknown, trying to make a name for himself in Nashville. He was working as a janitor at Columbia Records, where Johnny Cash recorded, and one day he managed to slip Cash a demo of his songs by landing a helicopter on Cash's lawn. Talk about making an entrance.
You gotta admire the audacity of that.
Right. And apparently it worked. Cash was impressed and ended up recording Sunday Morning Coming Down, which became a huge hit and helped launch Kristofferson's career. It's a reminder that sometimes you have to take risks and put yourself out there, even if it seems unconventional or even a little bit crazy.
Speaking of unconventional, we can't forget about Kristofferson's Hollywood career. This is a man who starred opposite Barbra Streisand in A Star is Born, for crying out loud.
It's another fascinating chapter in a life full of them. And like his music career, his acting choices were often unconventional. He wasn't afraid to play complex, flawed characters. He had this raw, rugged masculinity that translated surprisingly well on screen. Think about his roles in films like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid or Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. He brought a certain authenticity to those characters that was captivating to watch.
It's interesting, isn't it? You mentioned earlier that his early songwriting was considered too polished for Nashville, but when he transitioned to Hollywood, that same authenticity is shown through, even in a world obsessed with glamour and perfection.
That's a really good point. It seems like authenticity was always at the core of who he was. Whether he was writing songs, performing on stage, or acting in films, he wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to let his flaws show. And I think that's what resonated with people. He wasn't trying to be anyone other than himself. And in a world that often feels superficial and manufactured, that's a powerful thing.
Absolutely. So we've talked about his music, his acting, his impact on the outlaw country movement. What do you think is the legacy Kris Kristofferson leaves behind? What's the thread that connects all these different facets of his life?
That's a great question. I think ultimately Kristofferson's legacy is one of unflinching honesty and a willingness to defy expectations. He lived his life on his own terms, pursuing his passions, even when they led him down unconventional paths. And through his art, he gave voice to the struggles and triumphs of everyday people, reminding us that it's okay to be vulnerable to questioned authority, to search for meaning in a world that doesn't always make sense.
And he did it all with this incredible sense of poetry. I mean, you read through his lyrics and it's like you're reading the work of a literary master. This wasn't just songwriting, this was art.
Absolutely. He had a way with words, a gift for capturing complex emotions in these simple, elegant phrases that just burrowed their way into your soul. There's a reason why so many of his songs have become standards covered by artists from every genre imaginable. They tap into something timeless, something that transcends any one generation or musical style.
The obituary quotes him saying, "I wouldn't be doing any of it if it weren't for writing." It seemed like writing was the anchor that kept him grounded throughout all the ups and downs of his career, his personal life, everything.
It was clearly more than just a profession for him. It was his way of processing the world, of making sense of his own experiences and connecting with others. He even said once that his acting came from being known as a writer first. As if by writing his truth, he unlocked this whole other avenue for expressing himself, for embodying different characters and stories.
It's like all these different paths he traveled. Roads, scholar, soldier, songwriter, actor, they weren't separate journeys, but rather different verses in the same song. Each one informing and enriching the others in ways he probably couldn't have predicted.
Exactly. And that's an important reminder for all of us, isn't it? That life isn't always linear. That sometimes the detours and unexpected turns lead us to exactly where we need to be. That the key is to stay open to those possibilities, to embrace the unknown, even when it feels scary or uncertain.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, his music, his movies, his impact on country music. But for you, the listener, what's the takeaway from Kristofferson's story? Why should this legacy matter to us today?
I think Kristofferson's life, when you really dive into it, is an invitation. An invitation to embrace authenticity, to chase our own dreams, even when they seem impossible or unconventional. He reminds us that it's okay to question, to stumble, to be vulnerable, because it's in those moments, those cracks in our armor, that we often find our truest selves.
And he showed us that you don't have to fit neatly into any one box. You can be a scholar and a songwriter, a rebel and a poet, a lover and a fighter.
And that it's the contradictions, the complexities that often make life interesting. Kristofferson's life was a testament to that. He never stopped growing, never stopped evolving, and he never let go of that essential core of who he was.
So if you find yourself humming along to Me and Bobby McGee or any of his other unforgettable songs, take a moment to appreciate the depth and complexity of the man behind the music. Explore his catalog. Discover those hidden gems that speak to your own journey, your own search for meaning.
And maybe, just maybe, let his life be a reminder that it's never too late to chase that dream you've been putting off, to embrace the outlaw within yourself, and to live a life that's true to your own unique rhythm. After all, as Kristofferson himself saying, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Powerful words to live by. Until next time, keep diving deep.